So good afternoon all, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Marika van der Steenhoven, and I am the Special Collections Education and Outreach Librarian for the Bowdoin College Library. I am delighted to welcome you to our second program in our series, Beyond the Reading Room: Archives in the World. This is a virtual lecture series featuring artists, scholars, and Bowdoin College alumni who rely on archival research for their work. Each speaker has a connection to Bowdoin Library's George J. Mitchell Department of Special Collections and Archives, either having consulted our collections or having their own work represented therein. I want to thank the Bowdoin College Library for supporting this program. A heartfelt thanks goes out to Tony Sprague for his technical support, and of course to Alumni Relations for helping us spread the word about this program. Today we are joined by Pamela Zabala, Bowdoin class of 2017, who will be giving a talk entitled Learning from the Past, an archival exploration of Bowdoin's racial history, wherein she will highlight the role of archival research in her 2017 honors project on incidents of racial bias at Bowdoin. She will discuss how access to archival materials allowed her to contextualize the incidents at the center of her project within the broader historical context of race and racism at Bowdoin. She will also discuss some of her current graduate research on race and discuss the pros and cons of using archives in sociological research. I'd also invite you to mark your calendars for upcoming programs in this series. On November 16th, literary scholar Susan F. Beagle will share an illustrated lecture entitled Harriet Beecher Stowe, the Pearl of Orr's Island and Maine Summer Tourism, where she will discuss all of those things, plus the kind of ephemeral and archival material that has helped her in her studies. And then on December 3rd, Don Westfall, who is Bowdoin class of 1972, will talk about the extensive research he has been conducting in the college archives on the history of the college's land acquisition in the state of Maine. Again, I encourage you to join us for all of these programs and others, including our monthly Audubon Double Elephant Portfolio Birds of America page turning event. That is a real tongue twister right there. All of the events are free, open to the public, and are occurring virtually. You can register for these programs and check out what we've been up to in special collections at our news and events site, and I'll pop the link in the chat in just a bit. So I am really honored to introduce today's speaker, Pamela Zabala, again, Bowdoin class of 2017. We were just remarking about how 3 years ago seems like 10 years ago. Pamela is a PhD student in sociology at Duke University. Her areas of concentration are organizational sociology and race and inequality. Her current research addresses the experience of Latinx students at PWIs, race, education, and occupational outcomes, and the intersections of religion, migration, and politics via the New Sanctuary movement. At Bowdoin, Pamela earned a major in sociology with honors and a minor in Africana studies. Pamela's honors project, Cooperate with Others for Common Ends, students as gatekeepers of culture and tradition on college campuses, has been downloaded over 500 times from our digital repository and is an incredibly important piece of scholarship on the history of Bowdoin College. We, in Special Collections and Archives, regularly direct students, faculty, and other patrons to it as an important and relevant source in understanding the complexity of race on this campus. It's perhaps telling that crucial to the historical record of students of color at Bowdoin are the scholarly contributions of student researchers over the years. J. Arnett Mitchell, class of 1912, was the fourth Black student to graduate from Bowdoin. And in 1939, he wrote Bowdoin and Her Negro Graduates for the Bowdoin Alumnus magazine. Mitchell documents the lives of the college's first 9 Black alumni, memorializing the under-recognized figures who came after Russ Worm and before Project 65. Decades later, Ken Cheneau, class of 1973, produced a history honors thesis, The Black Man at Bowdoin, in which he compiled personal accounts from Black alumni on their experiences at the college. Wanda Evelyn Fleming, class of 82, conducted her own research on Black matriculation and graduation rates since 1826, finding that the class of 1973 had the highest percentage of Black students ever at Bowdoin, 30, but only 8 graduates. Fleming noted a significant number of Black students failed to graduate, and many of these left Bowdoin frustrated and embittered by their experience here. Pamela's work is part of this tradition, and her honors project has joined this important scholarly conversation. Rereading her thesis recently, I am particularly struck by its powerful clarity and call for others to engage and expand upon her research. Again, I am so grateful to Pamela for taking the time to share with us today, and I hope it inspires you in the audience to dig in and better understand the histories that shape our communities, our institutions, and our world. And without further ado, I hand things over to you, Pamela. Oh, one note, we will be doing Q&A at the end, and you can pop your questions throughout the program into the Q&A forum. Okay, now over to you, Pamela.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. If you'll just give me 1 second to share my PowerPoint here. I'm really excited to be here and get started. And thank you, Marika, for that wonderful introduction. So to recap a little bit, not too much, my name is Pamela, and I'm a PhD student at Duke. As Marika said, my areas of concentration are race and stratification and organizational sociology. I'm currently a 3rd year in the program, which means I'm just about to be halfway through, yay. And currently I am finishing up my coursework, finishing up my qualification requirements, and starting to put together my dissertation proposal, which I hope to defend and pass in the early spring. Before I brought all of that upon myself, however, I was a polar bear, and I specifically a member of the class of 2017. And while I was at Bowdoin, I had the opportunity to be a part of numerous groups and organizations on campus, including but not limited to athletics and res life and a bunch of other things. But the thing that's kept me surprisingly the most tethered to Bowdoin, even so long after I graduated, has been this honors project, which is what I'm here to talk about. So just to give you all a little bit of an overview, I'm going to start off by giving you some background information about how this project came to be. This means discussing, the specific events that were going on when I was a student, both on campus and, events that were going on in the nation more broadly. And I'm going to talk about the role that archives played in my research, and I'll end by talking about the role that archival research continues to play in my life as someone who is pursuing a graduate degree and as someone who is doing research on a number of different topics. So let's jump in. So the picture on that slide is me, project in hand, on the day that I submitted my honors project to the library. It was all done. I like to joke that you can tell I still had so many hopes and dreams in that picture. I look so young and happy, or I was just happy to be done with that thing. But when I was writing this honors project, the last thing I ever expected was for people to actually read it, never mind continue to engage with it. So I'm incredibly honored to be here. My project was on incidents of racial bias on college campuses and how these incidents, combined with the creation and the maintenance of white spaces, creates a culture of exclusivity on college campuses. But before I get too far into the project itself, like I said, I want to give some background about how this all came to be. So long before I had the opportunity to dive into the archives and do some serious data collection, this project got its start as the final paper that I wrote my junior fall for Professor Theo Green's Classics of Sociological Theory, my favorite class. The aim of this final project was to use the theorists we had learned about that semester to, and I'm quoting from Professor Green's syllabus, to analyze a current event or contemporary trend that has been well documented. So the theorist who had illuminated me the most that semester was W.E.B. Du Bois. And as we were reading and discussing, the souls of Black folk in class and a few other works, I saw a lot of parallels between what we were reading about and discussing and the events that were going on, both immediately on campus and in the country more broadly. So again, to kind of trigger your memory, this was the fall of 2015. So what was going on back then, right? So first, students were protesting administrative inaction at the University of Missouri. This was about a year, maybe a little less than a year after the Ferguson uprising. And this protest included a boycott by the school's football team, who refused to play until student demands, got a response. And it also included a student who went on a hunger strike. And it all ended with the termination of the university's president. This demonstration in particular garnered a lot of media attention, and it spurred similar demonstrations across the country on other campuses, like Harvard, Dartmouth, Yale, even universities overseas. So this was a really interesting moment because we saw students turning to their institutions and, essentially putting their grievances out there and demanding that these grievances be acknowledged. And they were also demanding that their institutions start to look inward and start questioning what is largely their really problematic histories of slavery and things like that. And so this piece about institutional history is really important. So we're going to circle back to that in a bit. But before that, I want to kind of resituate us in Brunswick, where Bowdoin had its own shakeups that semester. So that semester, the sailing team hosted what has come to be known as the Gangster Party. And that party was sandwiched in between two other incidents during my time here. Prior to this, the lacrosse team had received backlash for their annual Cracksgiving party, which featured members of the predominantly white team dressed up as Native Americans. And the semester after the Gangster Party was the so-called Tequila Party, during which partygoers dressed up in sombreros and for what they somewhat sarcastically called not a fiesta. So needless to say, campus was in turmoil my junior year. It was a very, very difficult time to be a student of color at Bowdoin that year. But I don't want to spend too much time on kind of the particularities of these individual incidents. I'm really just bringing them up to give you a background about how this project came to be and what inspired me to pursue this work. If you would like to learn more, I encourage you to Google them, read the Orient's coverage to kind of get an idea of what students were talking about, and read about them in the archives. There's documentation now. So thankfully, like all things, that school year came to an end. And up until this past year, I thought that was the longest academic year that I'd ever have to go through. But like I said, came to an end. And the summer of 2016, I had the opportunity to spend the summer on campus as part of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship. And that fellowship, which is for underrepresented undergraduate students who are interested in postgraduate education, allows students to spend a summer or two at their institution doing original research. By that point, I had personally made a couple of really important decisions. The first is that I definitely wanted to go to graduate school. And the second was that I wanted to expand the final paper that I wrote for Professor Green and turn it into an honors project, with the goal that, writing this into a bigger project would help facilitate later grad school applications. And I kind of saw a way to combine the two in a way that would help me out in my own academic goals as well. So I spent that summer here on campus getting started on my data collection. And this picture is actually the slide that ended up in my honors defense in the spring of 2017. Needless to say, I had to dig up a lot of stuff to prepare for this talk today, but here we are. So as you can see, this project featured 3 methodological angles that all kind of fall within the umbrella of qualitative research, right? So I did interviews with students. I kind of observed the preparation and implementation of orientation for the class of 2020, because Res Life and a few of the other offices on campus who were in charge of planning orientation were implementing some new programming in response to some of the incidents that had happened the semester before. And I spent an enormous amount of time in the archives, which is what the bulk of the rest of my talk is going to be about. So why the archival piece? In planning out this project, I decided that rather than looking outward and taking a comparative approach across multiple institutions, the best approach for me to take would be to look inward and actually use Bowdoin as a case study. So early on, I kind of oscillated between, do I want to do the NESCAC? Do I want to do the CBB? Do I want to do different types of institutions of higher education? And I really just settled on, no, let's just stay here, dig deep, and try to learn everything that we possibly can and paint as complete as a picture as possible. So this approach would allow me to take a deep dive into one institution rather than going broad and only getting what I presume would be a more surface level understanding of the historical background between incidents of racial bias. So this is the primary consideration that led me to do as much work as I did in the archives. I really just wanted to learn as much as possible and paint as complete of a historical picture as possible. So why did I want to know this history? One of the things that I wanted to show was that the 3 incidents that happened from 2014 to 2016 were not aberrations, right? One of the things we heard a lot when we were on campus is, oh, these are just one-off, really like not great things that are happening, but this isn't us, that these aren't things that happen continually. This is just the weirdness of this year and, all these elements coming together. This is totally random, right? But what I wanted to show was that, I want to show that there's precedent for both the incidents themselves and for the institutional response to the incidents. And so the argument that I try to put forth in my honors thesis is that these incidents are actually endemic to the culture of the institution, which creates the social conditions necessary for these incidents to keep on happening. So in other words, I wanted to show, if there were patterns to be found, I wanted to show the patterns of incidents happening over time. And I wanted to show these patterns, not just in and of themselves, but I wanted to show these patterns relative to both the college's efforts to diversify over time. And I wanted to show these patterns relative to its efforts to present itself as a progressive and forward-thinking institution. And by identifying these patterns, I hoped to then be able to theorize about what they meant for the culture of the campus. So what do I mean when I say, Bowdoin's efforts to present itself as a really progressive, forward-thinking institution all the time, right? Anyone who's seen me present anything about this project has seen this image before because I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite finds in the archives. And it's an ad that Bowdoin placed in Black Enterprise magazine in 1988 as part of an effort to recruit more Black students. And as you can see, the college in this ad claims a 150-year-long tradition of a commitment to Black Americans and encourages the reader to be a part of the next 150 at Bowdoin. However, when one glances at the materials in the archives and starts to interrogate that a little bit, we see that this isn't always the case. It's maybe not always a continuous 150 years, right? There are sometimes decades-long gaps in that 150 years. And especially when you look at kind of the earlier days, it was Russ Worm, and then 84 years went by, and then the second Black student. And so on and on and on until in the mid 60s, we get kind of an actual effort to continuously have this diversity effort on campus. So what in the archives did I actually look at, right? So I read every issue of the Orient from 1890 to the present, which at the time was 2016. So yeah, I split my archival work into kind of 2 parts. The first part is with the Orient, because what better source of the debates and discussions between students than the actual voice of the students. I started with the year 1984 out of random. It felt poetic, and I was lucky enough to kind of strike gold that year because there were a number of events that happened that year that students were contesting on campus. And in those articles, they also referred to things that had happened in the past. So at that point, I knew, okay, I need to work forward, obviously, and I also need to do a lot of work to look backwards as well. So starting in the weeks before I came for the Mellon program, I actually covered the period from 1964 to 2016. And then later on in the school year, I actually jumped back into the Orient and went all the way back to 1890, which is when you start getting references to the minstrel shows that were on campus, for example, in the early days. So the Orient was really the crux of the historical analysis here. And I supplemented that with material from the Bugle, which was the yearbook, and other materials from the archives. with references to historical works and other honors projects and other books that have been written about the college and about the town. So 3 things that I specifically looked for were instances of reported racism or incidents of racial bias, as we call them, accounts of Bowdoin's diversification efforts, and I also wanted to look for responses to events that were going on around the country, right? So responses to things like the civil rights movement, to affirmative action, all of these other debates that were going on. One of the things that this allowed me to do was to develop a timeline of racist incidents at the college, which allowed me to keep track of both the frequency of these incidents and the changing nature of the incidents themselves and the responses to the incidents at the college. This is just a portion of the timeline. I couldn't fit it all on the slide. But as you can see, the 1983-84 school year, which I mentioned, was where I kind of started out at random. There was an incident with a conservative student publication called The Patriot, which would come up a lot in the 80s, especially. So I also requested a number of boxes and files to be pulled for analysis. And here is where I kind of want to pause and commend the archive staff, right? So this list is a screenshot from the actual formal request that I had to write in order to have all these boxes and all these files pulled from the archives in order for me to read them. Not only did Marika and others kind of walk me through how to write this request, they taught me how to look for the materials I needed, how to properly indicate their location and name in the requests. There were some instances where I had to prepare even more formal requests than this for file access from the Dean of Student Affairs and things like that. And I received guidance on all of it. And what it would look like to fill out the paperwork and make sure it was all as well done as possible. So given that this was my first time ever setting foot in an archive, this help was invaluable. Okay, so I requested these files and many others later on. This was just kind of the first formal request that I made. And so looking at documents from admissions and multicultural affairs, among others, was really interesting because if we think about the ORIENT being the student voice, I kind of saw these as being the administrative voice. And being able to look through these files gave me an idea about how these two voices talk to each other while things were going on campus and how they responded to each other at different points. So at this point, I want to give a few examples of things that I found to kind of show what this all looked like, right? So here's one example. This is a letter that was sent to faculty and staff from the Office of Minority Affairs in the spring of 1989. And I'd like to read the first few sentences out loud. It says, "There's quite a bit coming from the magazine world these days about the new racism on many US campuses. Bowdoin has been lucky. We haven't had a major problem, but there's no guarantee that we will be spared in the future." Now, both the content and the timing of this letter is really fascinating because if we go back to my handy dandy timeline, we see that Bowdoin was indeed not spared. In that very academic year, maybe 2 or 3 months before these articles came out and this letter was sent out, there was another incident with the aforementioned conservative student publication, and there was a talent show performance at the pub in which a white male student donned blackface to engage in a lip sync performance of an Aretha Franklin song. So this kind of got my mind going about a few things. The first is, why did this administrator see Bowdoin as kind of being spared or being exempt at this point, right? Because obviously things have been happening on campus. Perhaps, if I had to venture a guess, it's because while there were, multiple incidents throughout the 80s on a lot of campuses around the country, a lot of the other incidents that were going on in the nation were very, very extreme. There were universities where their students were putting their Black students through slave auctions and mock slave auctions and things like that. So perhaps it's because, if we think about kind of a scale of extremity, Bowdoin is kind of, these things are kind of on, I guess, the lower end of that scale. But they're happening nonetheless. So here's where we kind of see a little bit of a gray area in the things that are going on kind of at the ground level and how they're being perceived and, by administrators and the apparent contradictions that exist there. So the next example is probably hands down my favorite exchange that I found between a student and an administrator in the archives. So this student took it upon themselves to write a letter about the quote, inconsistency of action taken by the college. And in this letter, he asks, shouldn't they, meaning athletes and fraternity brothers, aren't they also part of the college, and shouldn't they receive the same protection the college provides to other groups? The groups he's referring to, of course, are the quote, minorities, homosexuals, and women. He goes on to offer what I hope is a hypothetical. He writes, what if I express a stereotypical misconception stating that Blacks are lazy and stupid, deserving of the lower jobs in their low-class neighborhoods where they live and play basketball? Not only would I be castrated by the militant females on campus, but I would also be kicked out of school or something similar. Isn't the article about athletes the same kind of stereotype? He goes on to call the college hypocritical for responding to an anti-Semitic accident with a campus-wide letter, but not responding to the criticism that athletes at the time were receiving in the Orient and in a few other student publications. So in response to his question, the dean at the time says no. And I love this response in which he tells the student that, athletes and members of fraternities, even betas, are not in the same category as minorities, homosexuals, and women. To be an athlete or a fraternity member is a matter of choice. Second, athletes and fraternity members cannot have been said to be historically oppressed. Later on, they write, it may be that being a member of a group that is locally and temporally under fire will give you some inkling of what it must be like to be a member of a group that has been universally despised and oppressed, end quote. So being able to read and piece together exchanges like this and being able to contextualize the attitudes of both the students and the staff within the broader historical trajectory was invaluable for being able to understand kind of the growing pains that Bowdoin was going through. And it also helped me contextualize and understand better the 3 incidents that I was writing about that were going on in my time, because one thing that I realized is that there were so many parallels between the way that both students were responding and the way that administrators were responding. I used to like to say that you could take an article or something written in the Orient after one of the incidents in the 80s, make the date 2016, and almost word for word, it could be a response to something that had happened when I was writing this honors project, because the responses were so similar and there were so many parallels in the conversations that happened on campus afterwards. So needless to say, the archives played a crucial role in the production of this work. And as I mentioned, the ease of access to this material, the sheer amount of material there was to go through, and the ability to scan and photograph documents, and the amazing staff were invaluable to being in that space and being able to do this work. And I can also say that, my experience doing research in the Bowdoin archives was formative, completely formative to my career as a researcher, because even beyond Bowdoin, as I still do archival work, I'm using many of the skills that I learned while I was sitting in the archives the summer of 2016. It's an unfortunate reality that in graduate sociological education, especially a program like mine, which is very, very heavily quantitative, archival research is not really given priority as a research method to be taught. And even in qualitative courses that I've taken, we never once went over what it looked like to step into an archive and go through it and interrogate it and make that a useful part of a research agenda. So I was already primed going into graduate school because of this experience that I had. And it was very difficult to think of limitations because my experience was so positive. But from what I can remember, of the few things that I could pick out, not everything was as digitized to the extent that it is today. So when I say I spent time in the archives, I mean I literally spent time sitting in the archives, flipping through documents and reading old letters and getting dust in my nose. So I know that now, especially in light of AFAM 50, there was a big effort to get more materials online, and I've actually really enjoyed going through them, which is great. And I really hope students continue to dig into those. And as I mentioned earlier, I had to formally request access to some files from some higher ups at the time. And a slight limitation is that I was actually denied access to certain files. I'd like to be an optimist and say that it was because of FERPA or something. But the reality is that because of administrative overlap, when a meeting is held, everyone who participates gets a copy of the agenda or something. I actually ended up finding a lot of the files that I was denied access to in other boxes. So that raised the question for me of why specific offices weren't allowing me to see, certain things that I had requested. Um, because at least to my eye, when I eventually did find those things, there didn't seem to be anything specifically, personal or private about specific students. There was never any kind of like personal student information that was in those documents. So that's still a big question mark for me, but it ended up working out anyways. So lastly, I have quantity material here as a limitation as well, because there was just so much that I didn't get to use that would have been really interesting to include. So when I started out and I was visualizing what this project was going to look like, right? I wanted to do a chapter on admissions. I wanted to do a chapter on student activities. I wanted to do a chapter on academics and faculty. Like I wanted to cover all of it. I honestly believe that if I'd had another year at Bowdoin, I could have covered all of it. But didn't work out that way. And additionally, my honors project was already 30 or 40 pages over the departmental page limit. So I did not get to include a lot of those chapters that I had originally visualized. On a completely unrelated note, the sociology department coincidentally dropped the page limit even more the year after I graduated, but I'm sure there is no relation there whatsoever. So for students who may be interested in archival work or who may be considering archival work as part of this research agenda, a project like this seems like a massive, massive undertaking. It is. At no point do I want to give you the impression that any of this was quick and easy. This took months of work. And I actually ended up spending a year and a half as opposed to just a year working on my honors project. So I would give the following advice for a student who is interested. The first is to start early. Like I said, it takes time. Archival research is not a quick process. And this quote from a recently published article in a qualitative sociology journal, I think really gets at that point. The authors write, "The archive comes to resemble the ethnographic field site. It's not a static location waiting for researchers. Instead, archival work entails making sense of the resources that become available and assembling a specific collection related to the social issue, event, or problem. Historical researchers accumulate the details, and like ethnographers, they categorize observations, discard pieces of information that are unrelated to the topic at hand, narrow down their conceptual frameworks, and identify what remains essential versus what becomes excess or useless for the sociological cases." And I think that just hits the nail on the head in terms of, getting at this idea that being in an archive requires you to constantly be searching, refining, and redefining your own parameters and iteratively making sense of the materials as you kind of go through and extract what is useful and what is not useful. Next, I would say to keep an eye out for whose voices are privileged in archival materials and whose voices are missing from archival materials. Data are not neutral, and utilizing any data sources requires an interrogation about where it's coming from and whose views are being represented. And that's, again, something that comes with just spending time in an archive and being able to really learn how to recognize those things. Lastly, I would emphasize the importance of asking for help, especially if it's your first time using those kinds of data. Luckily, like I said before, the Bowdoin Archives has an amazing staff that will help you find whatever you need. My project ended up being a lot, and it was a huge amount of time that I spent in there, but it was made a lot easier by the folks who guided me through it. So there it is. There's the action shot. That's the picture of me nose deep in the Orient. This is during the last month or so of writing. My friend and honors suffering buddy, Lara, snapped this picture as we worked together in the sale room. Fun fact, about 85% of my thesis was written while I sat in Smith Union. So this was during hour 2 of one of several all-nighters we pulled in the weeks leading up to the submission date. Not pictured here is the large amount of snacks on the table and my archives binder, which I pulled out of my files to show you all, weighs about 20 pounds. And anyone who saw me anywhere on campus senior year saw me lugging this thing around. So there it is, and there's my honor sticker. I still have it. So what does it look like then to use archives out in the world beyond Bowdoin? Well, I'm still in school, so the reality is that my world hasn't taken too much of a leap from what I was doing. I'm still doing research, but I'd like to conclude by mentioning a few of the things that I'm working on now at Duke as a graduate student. So the first is a project on the New Sanctuary Movement, which is a movement on U.S. religious congregations who take in undocumented individuals into sanctuary on their grounds to protect them from deportation or other state action. So we are currently in the third wave of this movement. It started after the 2016 election. The first wave was in the 1980s, and the second wave was in the early 2000s. And a colleague and I have interviewed religious and lay leaders from over 40 congregations around the country in the past 4 or 5 months. And we're really just trying to learn about what it's been like for them to be a part of this movement. But this also entails learning about the prior waves of the movement as well. So we want to know about what were their main concerns, what were the big debates around sanctuary when it first started up, and we eventually hope to do kind of a cross comparison across the 3 waves to theorize about how the relationship between religious organizations and the state is evolving. Luckily, there were documents related to this movement in my new local archive in Duke's Rubenstein Library. This is an example from the Marshall T. Meyer papers of a letter that this individual wrote as part of the sanctuary movement, just trying to raise awareness and raise funds for the movement. And there's a really great quote in here that I love. You always find gems in archives. So it says, quote, "When the government itself sponsors the torture of entire peoples, then makes it a felony to shelter those seeking refuge, law-abiding protest merely trains us to live with atrocity," end quote. So very timely. And then we're also using archival collections that are held in other universities in other states. Most of them are out west, however, in Arizona or California, because that's where the movement really took root. So unfortunately, we can't travel right now, and these papers haven't all been digitized. So that's been a little bit of a delay, but hopefully once everything calms down a little bit, we'll be able to get out there. But again, this is an example of a brochure that was put out by the National Sanctuary Defense Fund in 1985 that they used to raise money, put out awareness, and kind of rile up the public a little bit around this issue. I'm also working on a project about the contestation of Latinidad on college campuses. So in this project, I'm looking at how Latinx undergraduates build community and contest notions of Latinidad, which is like their Latinx-ness. And I found so far that student organizations play a really important role in this process. So as with my Bowdoin project, I'm going into the Duke libraries to learn about the histories of these groups. And I'm really hoping to get a sense of what their history has been and to find out whether these issues that I've identified have always kind of been there. And that picture of what looks like Black scribbles is a picture of a mural that was defaced, a Latinx Heritage Month mural that was defaced my first fall at Duke. And that's an example of kind of a moment that, caused a lot of conversation and conflict within the Latinx community on campus. And then the last thing I'll add is before the pandemic, I had acquired funding to, and was all set to fly to the Dominican Republic to start some preliminary dissertation work. And I actually plan to spend some time in the National Archive, which is that AGN you see there at the bottom. My goal was to learn about the racial project of the Dominican government throughout the 20th century and the role that American imperialism played in kind of shaping the racial politics of the government through 2 U.S. invasions on the island. And this one especially hurts because the new president recently unclassified a ton of material from the time period that I was interested in, and now I can't go see it because we can't travel. But it is what it is, and I'm really glad that I still have ample opportunity to do archival work elsewhere and to have a busy research agenda. I'm going to conclude there with a profound thank you to Marika and the George J. Mitchell Department of Special Collections and Archives for the invitation to speak today. I also want to give a shout out and thank again the Department of Sociology at Bowdoin and my advisors, Professors Green and Nelson and Riley, who supported me in so many ways, both while I was at Bowdoin doing this project and even after I graduated my graduate career. And thank you to all of you who tuned in today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Pamela. This was truly fabulous. And to all those in the audience, I swear we didn't pay her to thank us so much. So please submit your questions or comments into the Q&A forum, and I will read those aloud and shoot them over to Pamela. So we've got one question already. Well, first is just a quick fun fact was that Laura actually worked for us here in Special Collections and Archives. So it all comes back to the archives, and I see her in the audience. So hello. Okay, so the first question here comes from Sophia, who asks, given you wanted to continue this work into other departments, would you be okay with current students trying to continue your work?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to continue doing this work. And it actually, like, I got chills when you said, Marika, earlier that my work was kind of adding on to this long tradition of students writing about food and then writing about these issues. And it's just, wow. Because you never think about that when you're actually writing it. You know, I very much set out to just write about what was going on and what I was seeing around me. And both, you know, write something that was informed by what I was experiencing as a woman of color moving through campus and what I was finding in the archives. And I absolutely encourage any and all student who is interested to continue doing this work.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, I mean, your work has been so important, right? And as I mentioned in the introduction, we share it as a resource often for students. And I think that it has also helped, you know, so much of the research that has been done by students has been around like the disparate, like the black-white dichotomy. And it's also been really interesting. And I know Professor Green has had students coming in and starting the research around Latinx students at Bowdoin, the history of Indigenous students, Jewish students. You know, it's been really wonderful to sort of look at the precedent from his student research and how that is continuing to evolve. And also to Sophia, like you articulate so beautifully in your honors project, Pamela, like what the other like what needs to come next too,
right.
Which is very, very cool. Okay, so we've got some more questions here. Lizzie says, great presentation, Pamela. And then there's a lovely smiley face emoji. What do you think about Bowdoin's response to the BLM movement?
So from the alumni perspective, I can say that a few of us were not surprised, but, you know, slightly disappointed at the initial kind of amount of time that it took at the beginning of the summer to just get anything out, put something out, say something, you know, we were waiting. Eventually the response did come. I think I've been most impressed by the efforts to fundraise and raise money and kind of get money going out to organizations. That's probably the one thing that I was impressed by the most. And then for some reason, this sticks out in my mind, but in one of the emails, you know, it's so tricky to put out like action items or next steps because it's just so hard to, there's so many moving pieces to all of these things. But one thing that stuck out to me, and I'll raise that as an example, is in one of the emails that we received, it notes that, you know, one of the efforts that Bowdoin wants to undertake is to recruit more student athletes of color to be on their teams, because athletics has kind of been notorious for having these issues, these issues of team culture. And so the solution, recruit more athletes of color. That's all fine and good. And I say this having been someone who was a 3-season athlete at Bowdoin. You know, I was around athletics all the time. That only goes so far. So, you know, what good does it do to bring in more student athletes of color if they're just going to leave their teams after a year or after 2 years, right? So those are the things we need to think about. It's, again, not just making these kind of surface level changes that look all nice at the beginning, but interrogating kind of the long-term implications of some of these changes and what they're actually going to affect in the long run. So that's kind of where my mind has been with the response. You know, there have been some aspects of it that I've been really impressed by. There are other aspects of it that just seem like more of the same from an alumni's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that actually leads me to Elizabeth's question here, which is, do you know whether your research had an institutional impact on the college's response to racial bias on campus?
I don't. It was really weird. So I wrote this. I had some administrators personally email me requesting it. So I personally emailed some people a copy of it, and then never heard anything. Not a peep again. Um, so in that sense, no. But what's been really, I guess, I get so emotional thinking about it, is that a lot of the faculty members that I had are now assigning it and they're sharing it with their students. The year after I graduated, it was reading in a first year seminar, which is just blows my mind because these aren't the things that you think will happen. So it's had a little bit more of an impact among students and faculty. I can't speak with any certainty about whether it's had an actual administrative impact on how it responds.
Mhm. This is a question from Liz. Hi,
Mhm.
Pamela. I noticed Yik Yak was on one of your slides. Was the role of those kind of ephemeral sources in, what was the role of those kind of ephemeral sources in your research?
Yeah, so
And
I had to
give
kind
us
of
a
be,
refresher on what Yik Yak even is.
oh God, it's scum. It's this awful app that is basically an anonymized Twitter feed. And it played a really, really big role in kind of stoking flames when I was on campus when all these incidents were happening, because students would go on, they would write things, they would respond to each other, but you never know who was saying what. And you never knew. And it got to the point where students were being called out by name on this app. And again, you didn't know who was writing these things. And so when I one of the things that happened was that for me and a lot of other students of color on campus, we just felt like what little sense of safety and security and trust we had in the institution and in our classmates was completely frayed, because we were essentially, being attacked blindly through this app and through other means. So Yik Yak is an app. It's thankfully died a very well-deserved death. And so I had to kind of be a social media detective a little bit when I was collecting these sources, because it was literally all just me screenshotting, me kind of downloading screenshots that other people posted on social media, and really searching for these posts because they're so crucial. I would have talked about them a little bit more, but I find that this topic tends to detract a little bit, and I wanted to stick to the actual physical archives. But something that happened while I was on campus is that someone actually printed out a lot of these posts and hung them all over campus so that people could see what students were actually saying on the secret app. So they played a really pivotal role in both my research and in kind of shaping what everything was looking like on campus back then.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to think about that, we do, the sort of the digital archiving of things. And my colleague, Megan Doyle, is much more equipped to speak on this as our digital archivist. But right, like thinking about how much of the student voice occurs online now,
Right.
and
Yes.
different ways to capture that, and thinking about the historical record of this moment in time.
Absolutely. That's the main reason I wanted to get those posts in here and talk about Yik Yak, because something
Mhm.
like that, it's hard to preserve something like that unless
Mhm.
someone actually goes and screenshots them all and saves them all. I still have that folder on my computer if the archives ever wants it.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I'm putting that off for up now. I have all those posts.
Amazing. Okay, the question we have next from Caroline is, amazing that you went through all the Orients. How did you record the data?
Yeah. So so this project was really a crash course in how to do research. And so I have somewhere on my computer is a massive spreadsheet where I organized all of the. So, okay, it starts with the actual reading. So I've literally physically read through every single issue of the Orient. It took a very long time. As I read, I, would highlight something that seemed relevant. I would then kind of make a note of it. And that would be kind of the first pass through. When I went back, I started kind of categorizing the things that I had highlighted as I went through. And from there, I started putting them into a spreadsheet, right? So I listed all the titles of the articles, their names, their dates, the authors. I color coded them all by like type of incident and what the response looked like. It was basically a massive spreadsheet is the answer to that question. A lot of notes in a massive spreadsheet. And so like, and I was kind of old school in the sense that like, I don't know if you can see in my archives binder, but I have a lot of little flags here on the side. Like all of those were just the articles that I used. Like this is quite literally like, it's the Orient. Like this is what I use.
And for those of you who aren't familiar, we do have the entire run of the Orient. So from its very first issue in 1871 all the way through, digitized and available on the Special Collections and Archives website, along with other important college materials such as president's reports, various different course catalogs, etc. But yeah, the digitized Orients are super useful. So you can download them as a PDF or you can read them online via Internet Archive. Okay, we have another question, and I'm apologize for mispronouncing Jada's name, most likely. My apologies. They say, great job, Pamela. I think it is important that you highlighted the institutional pushback that you experienced during this process. Academic fearlessness is encouraged as long as it is only hypothetical or theoretical. How do you encourage students to push the institution to change?
That's the $1 million question. I would say, I don't know. I wish I had a poetic, like nice answer that would kind of solve it all. But all I can really say is like keep elevating student voices. Like you don't need a Bowdoin sanctioned platform to elevate student voices. Find those platforms where you can and get your stories out there. Because I think ultimately like what you see like in the archives, for example, like the student voice comes through so strongly. And in ways that sometimes you don't think about, those student voices are recorded and they're heard and they're taken into consideration. Maybe not immediately, which is I think what we, in an ideal world, we would hope they would be taken into consideration more immediately. But I would just say that like continue to get student voices out there regardless of whether or not it's sanctioned. Because ultimately the students are the engine of any college. Without you all there, Bowdoin's empty buildings. So those voices are really important.
Evan says, wicked talk, Pam. Given the similarity of responses to these incidences by the administration that you pointed out, oops, his question just jumped. So let me start over. Given the similarity of responses to these incidences by the administration that you pointed out, it seems like we are repeating empty phrases that don't drive much effective change. In building the timeline of incidences at Bowdoin, did any trends emerge in the severity or frequency of incidents? Are there any shifts in campus culture or administration that you think are critical to moving the campus forward?
That's a phenomenal question. So I would say the biggest shift that I noted when I was going through all of this is we actually, there was a period in Bowdoin's history, I think it was maybe like early to mid 90s, where there wasn't kind of a major incident for maybe like 7 or 8 years. And that was the only kind of real gap that existed. After that, they kind of picked back up again. And one of the things that I noticed is that during that time, there were, I know we all hate committees, but there was a really impressive committee formed. I believe it was called the Bias Incident Committee or something like that. That I think did a really interesting job of kind of taking these issues head on. They did surveys of students. They kind of looked at what was going on at other institutions. They heard student voices. They, re-upped their emphasis on not just admissions, but on, what does the campus culture look like? So ultimately, like, I think it would take kind of a more holistic approach that really just takes a look at everything and not just admissions and not just getting students in the door. again, I'm not an administrator. I really wish I had better answers to these things, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay, we've got a few more questions here. This one's from Kelly, and they ask, could you speak to how you address the challenge of whose voice is present in the archival evidence?
Right. I I brought that up, that point about, whose voice is elevated and whose voices are not elevated in archives, because that is just kind of a general thing to think about in any archive. I was relatively impressed with the amount of student voices that are present in the archive. So if you look at the files from the what would become the Black Student Union, the African American Society, all these early groups that all these early affinity groups that formed on campus. There are great collections. All these student publications are in there from these groups that formed on campus. And I had an absolute blast reading through all of them. So in this particular kind of research experience, I didn't find that as much, that there were a lot of voices missing. But one thing that's interesting about Bowdoin is, like you mentioned earlier, Marika, is that there's this really like binary just culture on campus where you sometimes don't really think about Native students. You sometimes don't really think about Asian American students. You don't really think about Latinx students, Middle Eastern students, whoever it may be. And if anything, I think those voices were the ones that were missing, is these other groups. And that I think is more, that's just endemic to how we think about race in America in general. It's kind of really black, white, and everyone else in between, kind of figuring things out. Those are the voices that I would say that I kind of ran into that were missing, that I would have liked to have heard. If I had, again, all the time and resources in the world, I would have liked to write about what it looked like for these other groups to be at Bowdoin, and to grow their numbers. I always kind of highlighted but never went back to articles about what Asian American students were experiencing at Bowdoin and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, always kind of keeping in mind about who holds an archives, who put it together, whose voice is there, whose voice isn't.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that your work too sets a wonderful sort of template or methodology, right, for how we could look at different demographics of student body. It looks like we have one time for just one more question. So next up is David, class of 1976, who says, great research and presentation. When the history of racial relations at Bowdoin is revisited, it may be worthwhile to explore in college documents whether Bowdoin's presidents from the 19th well into the 20th century openly endorsed white supremacy and racial hierarchies, since these perspectives were part of mainstream thought, i.e. eugenics during this period.
Absolutely. That is so absolutely true. I would be interested, especially in looking at like what the medical school was doing, because Bowdoin had a medical school for a while. Something that always stuck with me is that I talked briefly about how there was minstrelsy on campus and in Brunswick and town that students would participate in. And a really interesting trend that I believe I wrote about in my honors project is that when minstrelsy started to kind of become popular as a form of entertainment on campus, it had been declining in popularity in the United States for years.
Mm-hmm.
So as it was kind of, like I said, declining, like there weren't as many minstrel shows happening elsewhere in the country. All of a sudden, we see this like uptick in minstrelsy on college campuses, and at Bowdoin in particular. And we have these traveling troops coming through to do performances for admitted students weekend, right? So those are the kind of interesting trends that I highly encourage people to keep looking into and to keep exploring. Because why did that happen? Those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking.
Yeah. So we are just up to our hour limit here. Pamela, I want to thank you so much for your thoughtful presentation, for your incredible research, for really taking the time to share with us. I know we have current students that are in the audience today, as well as alumni and everyone in between. And your perspective and reflections on this process have just been so valuable. For those in the audience, I have popped a link both to Pamela's honors project, so you can dig in and read for yourself her amazing work, as well as a link to our website, the Bowdoin Special Collections website, where you can read about other student research. There's a fabulous project or article listed right now up there about Destiny Kearney, who is doing research sort of in a similar vein in terms of thinking about how race influences how visual arts has been taught at Bowdoin and beyond. Yeah, it's a really cool project
That's really cool.
Of, as well as links to our future programming. So thank you all for attending. Pamela, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
So honored.
Yeah, and we will see you all next time for our next program. So be well and take care of each other. And yes, again, Pamela, thank you.
Bye, everyone.